الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم ربنا أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. اللهم ربنا أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. اللهم ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم صل صلاة كاملة وسلم سلاما تاما على سيدنا محمد الذي تنحل به العقد وتنفرج به الكرب وتقضى به الحوائج وتنال به الرغائب وحسن الخواتيم ويستسقى الغمام بوجهه الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته في كل لمحة ونفس بعدد كل معلوم لك. اللهم في هذا اليوم المبارك فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. والطف بنا وبهم يا رب أرحم الراحمين. والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. صلى الله تعالى على رسول خير خلقه محمد وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. آمين 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 يا رب العالمين. Okay, we've already gone through this, but we'll just start from here to keep the continuity. Modern Muslims are therefore faced with the challenge of reconciling two facts: the ontological fact of the state as an undeniably powerful presence, and second, the deontological fact of the necessity to bring about a form of Sharia governance. So, a state is present as a fact, and as a Muslim, you are supposed to implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all aspects of your life, including the state. So that's his presupposition. Obviously, we do accept that this is a fact. But our claim is that so state is present as a fact, and as a Muslim, it's the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all aspects of your life. You implement those commands all aspects of your life, including state. But our claim is that modern state as an institution is intimately linked with capitalism and obviously democracy, which is capitalist democracy. People call it constitutional democracy. And imperialism, which is, you can't have capitalism without imperialism. Imperialism is part and parcel of capitalism, and it's dynamic. So what you need to do is, so inherently modern state is incapable of subserving itself to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it is basically created to subserve the command of the capital. So if you try to implement, if you are able to, like if you live in a Muslim majority and you win election, for example, you try to implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you won't be able to unless you deconstruct this state, and sooner or later the state will distort the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will be implementing it partially, or the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala itself will become an instrument of this state. As happened with many Gulf states which implement Sharia partially and selectively, or in Turkey, for example, or in Egypt when Islamists came to power. So what you need to do is to deconstruct this state, and the process for that is initially to build a state within a state at micro level. And after a long struggle, this state will. So this, if the struggle is successful, this state will become powerful, and eventually this state will be overthrown totally and deconstructed, and a new state will be erected, which is an Islamic state. That state will accept the implementation of and be a vehicle of the implementation of the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That state would be a totally different from a capitalist state. That's the state we call Islamic state. And that's what happens. So, for example, that's what happened in Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in Makkah there was a state, the Meccan state. It had its own parliament, Darun Nadwa. It had its own ministries and its own offices, which were distributed among different tribes of Quraysh, different clans of Quraysh, Bani Hashim, Bani Abdiddar, Bani Makhzum, and all this. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't participate. He refused to participate in part of this state. They offered him through Abu Talib several times. What he did is he built his own state within a state, and it has its different manifestation and micro institutions, different organizations. For example, Darul Arqam was one of them. Dar ibn Sayyid was the other one of them, and there was part of this organization which was in Habasha, for example, and the others were in spread around different tribes of Arabia. The people who became Muslim, and the Prophet ﷺ told them to go back to their tribes and wait for his orders. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina, and then he built his Mubarak state, Dawlat al-Islam in Medina al-Munawwara. And from that state, whose center was Masjid al-Nabi and the Masjid of Quba, Islam spread around the world. So where did we start from? Lost the chain of that. Let's go back to the text. So the problem with Hallaq is that alongside many Islamists who he criticizes, he shares with Islamists this ludicrous assumption that the Sharia would be, or the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be applied to this state, the capitalist state. And obviously Islamists have tried it, and they try it, and they fail, because that state is created for a totally different function. And it is not just that its constitution is totally different from Islamic State, but it is situated within a web of relations with other states in a subordinated capitalist and imperialist web of relations, which functionally make it impossible for it to do anything else, really, except for very minor deviation from its path. So in a sense, Hallaq shares the basic premise with the so-called Islamists is trying to criticize, with this difference. The Islamists he criticized, they think that modern state is sort of a neutral institution, and you can capture modern state through election or whatever. So if you establish a government which is an Islamic government, that is, it consists of Muslims who want to implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all aspects of our life. When they preside over government, they will use this modern state institution to implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I think the error of the Islamist is not understanding. So they are right in saying that state is very important, and they're right in saying that command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to be implemented in all aspects of life, and state is a very important aspect of life in modern life. But they don't understand the nature of the state, and they don't understand the nature of change. So although many of them talk about revolution, what they are actually after is some sort of a reform, really, of a capitalist system. But we argue that you can't reform a capitalist system. If you try to reform a capitalist system, you will actually be reforming Islam and distorting Islam. Now, Hallaq, obviously, as a non-Muslim, I don't think he cares about the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But he thinks that a state, I think he is correct in thinking that modern state, you can't implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think he is correct in that. But from this, somehow he draws the conclusion that you don't need to worry about modern state, and somehow you will implement the sovereignty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without worrying about state. I don't know, we will see whether this state will wither away or what will happen, I don't know. But practically what he is saying is Muslims shouldn't worry about overthrowing this state. And they probably can implement the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their communal life, etc. I mean, and that would be a great news for capitalist, imperialists and their lackeys in the Arab and in the Islamic world. Okay, so yet as located in the modern condition, this wish entails an aporia. Which wish was that? Wish for the Sharia to return in one form or another is to state that what anyone with the question or the question why they will be answered in good part in the following chapter, although it's not an intended objective. Wish is aporia. Muslim today, including their leading intellectuals, have come to take the modern state as for granted. In a way which we just described, they take it as granted as a fact, but they also take it as a granted that they don't see any need to actually deconstruct it. Yeah, that's true, and I think they're wrong in that. But probably Hallaq's view is that you shouldn't worry about modern state. I don't know, I will say. They often assume it not only to have existed throughout the long course of their history, but also to have been sanctioned by no less the authority than the Quran itself. So, I mean, Quran itself obviously sanctioned Muslims to form associations, and state is part of a human association. You can't have a society without a state. So that's a sort of obvious thing. But obviously, modern state is not sanctioned by the Quran. In the same way, Darun Nadwa wasn't sanctioned by the Quran or the Prophet. So that's here is a slide of hand, So there's a sleight of hand in his argument here. The footnote mentions somebody called Jackson, Islamic Law and the State. So if you want to, page number 190. Okay. Even nationalism, an unprecedented phenomenon. I mean, how is nationalism unprecedented? Modern nationalism is. Like, that's the thing, you keep doing it. But nationalism is something very primitive. Yes, modern nationalism is a unique thing, no doubt about that. But not nationalism as such, because that's the thing. So he said the state is a unique phenomenon, modern state, from which he seems to infer that a state didn't exist before modern state. So he sort of equivocates between modern state and state. They are not. Obviously, modern state is a unique phenomenon in the sense that it's unlike any state in its complexity and its nature, and which existed before. But doesn't mean that a state didn't exist. Similarly, nationalism, modern nationalism, is a unique phenomenon because modern nationalism is related to capitalism. It's a political ideology. It's a political organization which is related to capitalism. So capitalism is belief in freedom of human beings, and it can form individual. I mean, this is very superficial, but just to give you an idea. The level of species, and at the level of groups, social groups and communities. So here you have liberalism and individualism. So here you have socialism and those sort of ideologies, and here you have nationalism. And obviously in modern, these all interact, these are liberalism, socialism and nationalism to form modern states. So there's no pure liberalism, because most of liberal states today are also national, but they are not nationalists per se, so they are different from nationalists. So they are different from Nazis and fascist states, but they're still, that's a liberal nationalism. So there's then socialist nationalism, then there is other forms of nationalism, uh, uh, more pure nationalism, and then you have fascism and Nazism, which are extreme forms of nationalism. So these all, so we sort of distinguish between these ideology, but in the constitution of modern way of life, they're all ideologies of capitalism. So liberalism, socialism, nationalism, they're all ideologies of capitalism, and they exist today within modern world uh, in a way in which they interact with each other. So they form, so even those states which we call liberal states, modern liberalism, although it criticizes socialism and nationalism, it takes it is influenced by those ideologies. So modern liberalism, so that's why in modern liberalism you have forms of socialism and nationalism. Sometimes it takes the form of social democracy, sometimes more towards the right, sometimes more toward the left. But they you don't have liberalism without nationalism, for example, today. So when he said that nationalism is uniquely constitutive of modern state, in a sense he's right. In a sense he's right, because all states are nation states. Even America, which is sort of come near to acting as a global state, but it is not really a global state, and that's the contradiction in it. So that's why it can't, because its legitimacy and its political structure is all national. So in that sense, nationalism is a unique phenomenon. All states are nation states, and obviously Islamic State won't be a nation state. But that also doesn't mean that it won't start with somewhere in nation, like so. And it would be a great test of any Islamic state, like Iran and Afghanistan, for example, not to they are necessarily based in a geographical space and historical time, but at the political level, how they will transcend the nation, the political nationalism, is a great test for them, obviously. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. So even nationalism, an unprecedented phenomenon and one uniquely constituted modern state, said to have been launched into the world by Islamic holy country. Nationalism. Well, nationalism is kufr, Islam. So that's obviously, if somebody says that. Similarly drafted in Medina 14 years ago. Let's look at this footnote and then we'll stop here. Okay, so this is saying the Islamist says that nationalism was initiated by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, which I doubt. Anyway, he called the Islamic State Mahmoud al-Dawla al-Islamiyya النظام السياسي قريشي النظام السياسي on the history and composition of the so-called Constitution of Medina. Now, a lot of people, obviously, they're wrong to call Misak Medina Constitution and that's because they don't understand the Constitution, the nature of Constitution model. So it's not that they don't understand the mithaq, but they misunderstand, they misconstrue the waqia, the actual Constitution and its nature. But obviously, Hallaq doesn't try to understand. He's quoting these people right, left, out of context, in context. I mean, I'm very critical of Islamists, but I still have, try to understand them sympathetically. But it doesn't seem to. So anyway, on the history and composition of Constitution drafted around the Sunnah Constitution, Ajman here. Anachronistic use of the term state in Constitution. So his main thing is to probably probably show that Medina was not a state, which is a lame thing to do, because unless you think that your unique conception of a state is the only definition of a state. But he's right that Misak Medina is not a constitution, and the Medina state wasn't a constitutional state, it wasn't a capitalist state. It was an Islamic state par excellence. Okay, we'll continue from here, inshallah. We'll stop here.